So let's dive into one of the most brilliant, just absolutely masterful arguments in ancient literature. It comes from the book of Hebrews, and it's this incredible story that weaves together a mysterious king, a huge theological puzzle, and a really, really radical idea. Okay, I want you to imagine something. You have to convince people that an institution, a priesthood, that has been the absolute center of their culture for 1,000 years is, well, that it's over. That's a huge task, right? How in the world could you possibly persuade people to move on from something that foundational? Well, the author's solution was just genius. They reached way back into the archives of scripture, back to the book of Genesis, and pulled out this figure who is so obscure he only shows up for a couple of verses. And this character, he becomes the key to unlocking an entirely new way of understanding faith. So to really get this new priesthood, we first have to wrap our heads around the puzzle the author was trying to solve in the first place. Here's the core problem. To be a priest in the Jewish tradition, you had to be a descendant of Levi, and specifically of Aaron. Your family tree, your genealogy, that was everything. But Jesus was from the tribe of Judah. That's the royal line, not the priestly one. So how could he possibly be a high priest? It just doesn't compute. It's a non-starter. And this is where the author pulls out their secret weapon. It's this one cryptic line from Psalm 110. It talks about a totally different kind of priesthood, one in the line of Melchizedek. This single verse becomes the cornerstone for the entire argument. So who on earth is this Melchizedek, and why does he matter so much? To answer that, the author basically puts on a detective hat and goes back to the only other place Melchizedek even appears, a really brief encounter with Abraham way back in Genesis 14. And they scrutinize every single detail to build this case. First up, they decode his name and his title. Melchizedek is interpreted to mean King of Righteousness, and his title, King of Salem, as King of Peace. Now look, these aren't just cool-sounding titles. For the author, they're like giant blinking arrows pointing to the Messiah. They echo prophecies, like the ones in Isaiah, that describe the coming Messiah's kingdom as being all about justice and endless peace. So the argument is that this ancient king's very identity was a preview of the Messiah. And then the author does something really clever. They point to what the Genesis text doesn't say. Think about it. There's no family tree for Melchizedek, no mention of his parents, his birth, or even his death. He just appears on the scene. And then, poof, he's gone. Now, this isn't just a case of missing information. The author is using this brilliant interpretive tool that we could call eloquent silence. The idea is that what is left out of Scripture is sometimes just as meaningful as what's put in. That silence is intentional, and it's trying to tell us something big. So here's the knockout punch. By leaving out any mention of a beginning or an end, the text presents Melchizedek as this figure of eternity. And that puts him in direct contrast with the Levitical priests, whose entire job qualification was their family tree, their biology. Melchizedek's priesthood, then, isn't based on who his dad was. It's based on something completely different, an eternal, indestructible life. Okay, so the stage is set. The author has established Melchizedek as this mysterious, eternal priest king. Now comes the main event, proving that this priesthood isn't just different, it is way, way superior. Let's break down this incredible logic. Step 1. In the Genesis story, Abraham, the great patriarch of Israel, gives a tithe, a tenth, to Melchizedek. Step 2. The author argues that in any transaction like this, the one who receives the offering and gives the blessing is obviously the greater, more important party. And then step 3 is the masterstroke. At that moment, Levi, the ancestor of all the future priests, hadn't even been born yet. He was, as the text says, still in the loins of his great-grandfather Abraham. So the conclusion? In that one act of Abraham paying homage, the entire Levitical priesthood was symbolically bowing down to the superiority of Melchizedek. So what you end up with is this really clear pecking order. On one side, you have Melchizedek, who represents this eternal, transcendent order. And on the other, you have Abraham and his descendant Levi, who represent a mortal order, totally bound by time and biology. And the logic is just simple. The greater always blesses the lesser. But look, this isn't just some dusty theological debate. This argument has massive, real-world consequences for the entire system of worship. So the author poses this critical question, and it's a great one. If God is introducing a new and better order of priests, hundreds of years after setting up the first one, what does that imply about that original system? And the implication is nothing short of revolutionary.
You see, the Levitical priesthood and the law of Moses were totally intertwined. They were two parts of the same whole. You can't change one without changing the other. So if the priesthood is now obsolete, then the entire law and the entire covenant it served must also be set aside for something new.
And this brings us to a straight-up comparison of the two systems. The Old Covenant, it was based on law, served by mortal priests who had to make the same sacrifices over and over again, and ultimately it could never truly perfect the worshipper's conscience. The New Covenant, though, is based on God's unbreakable promise. It's served by an eternal priest who offers himself just once, for all time. And the outcome? Perfection, direct access to God. And we gotta talk about that word, perfection, because it's key. Here, it doesn't mean becoming morally flawless, like you never make a mistake again. It means achieving the ultimate goal of the whole system, having your conscience so completely wiped clean of guilt that you can stand right in the presence of a holy God without any fear. And that, the author argues, is something the old system could never quite do. Okay, but hang on a second. This whole new covenant is sealed by a human death, by Jesus' sacrifice. An idea like that is completely forbidden in the Torah. So how did it become the absolute centerpiece of this new understanding? Well, this concept didn't just appear out of thin air. It actually has a deep theological history, a logic that developed within Judaism itself over hundreds of years, especially during really intense periods of persecution. We can actually trace this evolution. It all starts with Deuteronomy's core idea of the covenant. If the nation is obedient, it gets blessed. If it's disobedient, it gets a curse. Fast forward to the Maccabean Revolt, when righteous Jews were being tortured and killed for their faithfulness to God's law. Jewish thinkers at the time started to see these obedient deaths not just as a tragedy, but as a powerful atoning sacrifice, a perfect act of obedience that could actually reverse the national curse caused by everyone else's disobedience. So when the early Christians came along, they tapped directly into this exact way of thinking to understand Jesus' death. And if you want proof that this idea was in the air, you don't have to look far. In a Jewish text written before Jesus, called 4 Maccabees, the martyr Eleazar prays this exact prayer. He offers his life as a purifying ransom for the whole nation. The idea of a substitute and atoning death was already a powerful part of the theological world. So we're left with this. When you understand the intricate logic, the rhetorical tools, and the history behind this argument in Hebrews, you see it's not just a statement of faith. It's a masterful, step-by-step piece of reasoning that was designed to literally change the world. And that raises a final question for us, doesn't it? How does seeing the machinery behind these ancient arguments change the way we read and understand these foundational texts today?